This episode of Bizarcast is brought to you by Jotunheim Nutrition, the best way in America. Stop giving your money to the multinational globalist vampires that hate your guts and sell you poison, and get some good stuff from somebody that cares about you, that loves you, and wants to give you good products for you and your body. So go to JotunheimNutrition.com. Welcome to the Bizarcast, the official podcast of the Bizarchives, weird tales of monsters, magic, and machines. A podcast where we do interviews, one-on-one interviews with the authors of the Bizarchives. And with us this evening, we have the author of Kiriath of Drewbury Moor, the first story in the Bizarchives, Mr. Robert C. Booth, all the way from England. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. So let's get right into it. For folks that may not have gotten a chance to dig into Bizarchives, what is Kiriath of Drewbury Moor about?
Well, it's about a reluctant investigator by the name of Reuben Bennett who finds himself embroiled in a sort of supernatural conspiracy involving and I suppose you could call her a fey creature that lives on the hills of the Pennines in England. That's where it's set. It's a sort of supernatural horror story, really.
Yeah, very cool. And quite a few people have said that they really, really enjoy this short story. So, what has
Excellent.
really been kind of the highlights of Kiriath of Drewbury Moor is your use of very English kind of dialect as well as English folklore, and there's a lot that goes into it. Can you give us an explanation on why you decided to have this very regional flavor to your story and what inspired you to make this story?
Well, funny enough, what inspired me at first was a dream I had. Actually, the dream was very similar to. I don't want to give away too much of a book, but there's a scene of the book where the characters are being chased towards a train station, and that comes from a real dream I had a few weeks before I wrote the story. And I combined that with a few other experiences from life, including an incident I actually lived through on the hills of the Pennines, and combined that with some Welsh folklore, which is where the Kiriath comes from, and that sort of amounted to the story. I use a lot of regional dialect, mainly because it's what people speak like that where I live for the most part. At least it's certainly used to. Dialects have become softened in more recent years, but I felt it added more to the atmosphere of Victorian English northern town in the shade of the Pennines, if people spoke more genuinely, to be honest, more as they actually did at the time.
That's fascinating. And what exactly is a Kiriath? Here's one of the things that folks do say. They say, how do I pronounce this? You know, especially for us
Hmm.
Americans. It's a very archaic word. What is a Kiriath?
A Kiriath is very similar to a Banshee, and I believe they probably are basically the same thing. But a Kiriath is a fey creature from Welsh myth who wails to foretell. Yeah, to foretell the death that's forthcoming. and they are fey creatures, so they're very similar to elves and banshees and these kind of things and leprechauns. It's in a similar kind of continuity, as a kind of supernatural creature.
And where you grew up. Now, obviously, like everywhere in the world, people have grow up with stories of folklore and paranormal or supernatural creatures that maybe live in the woods and the wilderness and stuff like that. Did you grow up with
Hmm.
a lot of these stories and this belief in these kinds of creatures or entities?
Well, there weren't a great deal of stories by the time I was born, but the region I live in was a place where people strongly believed in the Fae as a group of beings up until about the 19th century. I'd have myself experienced certain things which led me to believe very strongly in the existence of the Fae. I mean, where I live, I mean, I did, I mentioned in the blurb that I live in the wooded shade of England's Spine. That's a reference to the woods near where I live. And that place was known in local legends to be a home to, in recent years, more recent years, they were termed as fairies. But I suppose in the past it would have been known as elves and things of that nature. So where I live had a massive impact on the story, of course.
And when did people maybe like stop believing in these fey creatures, or are there people around that still really believe in it?
Well, there are very few people these days where I live that still believe in them. Unfortunately, where I live, up until, we'll say, the early half of the 20th century, it was a small farming town. And people in small farming towns up until the 20th century still usually believed in the supernatural to some extent. And they still do in the more remote regions of the British Isles and Ireland. But where I live is part of an area which is sort of the city of Manchester expanded, and we sort of became enveloped by it, and as a result, and the result of the industrialization of the area,
Mhm.
I think it sort of chased away the myths about elves and the fey creatures and spirits and that sort of thing, which I think is a terrible shame.
Because you yourself are a believer of these
Mm,
creatures.
very strongly so, yeah.
Fascinating. So, getting into like your style of writing and
Mm,
kind of because you have another story that's going to be featured in Bizarchives too. We're not going to break the ice on that one quite yet because
mm.
for various reasons. But um, for your style of writing, can you kind of give us a an overview on how you got into writing and maybe some of the authors that really inspired you?
Right, well, at first, I suppose you'd have to begin with my love of reading, I suppose. I imagine that's where most people's love of writing does originate. With me, it originated from boredom at school, which has been a bit of a theme of my whole academic career, really. And so my teachers decided to tell my mother to take me to the library, and that's where I started reading. I started reading at a very young age, and I became obsessed with reading. I remember reading C.S. Lewis's, I'm not sure the name of the overarching series, but The Lion, the Witch, and the Ward is Narnia series. I
Yeah.
started reading those at a very young age, at the age of about 6 or 7. And I became, I became to love fantasy, really, and Lord of the Rings later on, and things like that. I've always loved reading, and as a result of reading, as a child, I always wanted to be an author. So over years, I've pottered about with stories here and there, but to be honest with you, I've always lacked confidence, and so I had quite a lot of projects that I've started and not finished over the years. But when I saw your specifications for a Bizarchive, I'm not sure what it was in exactly, but it just allowed me to get my head together, and I sat down, I cracked on, and I wrote the story, The Kirith of Drewbury Moor, and I'm very proud to have finished it.
Yeah, and it turned out to be a wonderful story. But
Thank you.
speaking on the Bizarchives, what was how if you could give folks kind of that are on the outside kind of a view of what you think the vision of Bizarchives is and kind of your experience getting involved with Bizarchives as it's sort of blossoming into a
Hmm.
legitimate publishing outlet.
Well, from what I can tell about the Biz Archives, is it's rooted in the pulp fiction of the early half of the 20th century, And I am a fan of some of those things. I'm a massive fan of H.P. Lovecraft. I imagine that probably is a bit obvious to anybody who's read the story. But I think it's a genuinely excellent project. I think it's brought together some very talented writers who, for the most part, are almost completely unknown to the public. And I think the quality of writing is absolutely superb. I honestly can't believe that my story is sat there with all those other stories that have been written by so many other great writers. I think it's a wonderful vision that that you've got for the Bizarchive. I don't want to give away too much for to viewers, obviously, but you don't want to tell them.
Yeah. So, now that Bizarchives is kind of like it's really starting to hit its stride, and we
Hmm.
got we have a clear
Yeah.
vision. We got a lot of stuff coming out. What can um what can readers expect from Robert C. Booth moving forward, or do you have, or you're just kind of playing it by ear? What comes out at the time?
Well, a bit of both, I suppose. I have got a fairly strong idea for the direction my stories are going in. Do expect a return of my characters from the first story at some point or another, if not in the next issue, then perhaps in subsequent issues. But I have been mulling over in my head the idea of doing a longer story. Actually, at times I do wish I'd saved the Kira Fajrubi Moore story for a longer story because it started in my head. It's there are sequels that have already been written and there's sequels that are already waiting to be written, and I think it could have been a larger story. But I have got other stories on the way, which I may be willing to submit to be printed into a novella of some kind.
So, can folks expect more of the English folklore kind of Lovecraftian inspired kind of flavor that they've read in Kiriath Drewbury Moore?
Oh yes, absolutely, definitely. It's I suppose you could say it's the world I live in myself, so it makes absolute sense that more English and British folklore generally will be appearing in my stories. It won't be just be English, of course. It will be Welsh folklore, Irish folklore, Scottish folklore. I'm influenced by all these kinds of things.
And as far as the characters that appear, because it's like a lot of times you mentioned pulp, and we're going to talk about pulp in a minute, but a lot of
Mm,
times in pulp, it generally features a single protagonist, right? You know, like in my story,
yeah.
my story series featuring Lucius Lex. Lucius Lex is mostly the what the story is based around. There's usually only one guy or girl that's the protagonist. However, yours is a little bit different in that it has a team of people. Are there people in real life that inspired you to create these people? Because, for example, Robert E. Howard, he said that
Mm,
Conan was an amalgamate of many different men that he met in his life, between miners and oil workers and people in his family and so on and so forth. And Conan was just kind of an amalgamate of the characteristics of these many people that impressed him throughout his life. Did you have this kind of similar process in creating the characters in Kiriath Drewbury Moore, or were these just kind of characters that you invented in your head?
Well, I imagine. Well, the first character, Reuben Bennett. I don't know if anybody has noticed from the name Reuben Bennett, right? There is a bit of a, at least the the first letters of each of those those names is the same as my own name. So Reuben Bennett probably started off as a sort of fictionalized version of myself, and but he quickly morphed into a creation all of his own. And as for the other two main characters, Eleanor Townley and Joseph Rathbone, I think both of them are amalgamations of various people I've both met and read about over the course of however many years. So to say, I suppose you could say they came from my head, but nothing really truly comes from just your head, does it? Your head's as good as the input that's gone into him in the past.
So, I like to think that pulp authors are really good at letting characters take a life of their own. Here's what I
Mm,
really love about pulp stories: is pulp stories, they generally don't have much exposition. They generally don't have much of an introduction. If they do, it's
mm,
very brief. And pulp authors do a very good job of allowing their characters develop as they interact with the world. So, in Kiri After Drewbury Moore, you do a very good job of kind of giving a personality to these characters as the story unfolds. What is kind of your creative process to kind of giving life to these characters in your head? For example, when I create a character, this character comes to life in my imagination. I will have X, Y, and Z elements of their personality that I've maybe taken from other characters or people I know in real life or whoever, somebody I see on TV. It could be from anywhere, or and a lot of times from myself. I'll take elements of myself, as as you just said you did, and then I create this character in my head. I figure out the quirks of how he talks. I figure out his demeanor, his persona, whether he has a temper, what sets him off, and these characters just kind of come to life in my head. Would you say that your creative process is similar to that, or do you have something that's completely different?
Well, I wouldn't say it's completely different, but often the case is that for a first draft at least, I will sit down and I will just write. And the settings, the people, and all these kind of things usually just come to me as I write. It's almost entirely intuitive. I have an idea of what a person would sound or look like almost as soon as the concept of them appears on the page. I know what that person sounds like. I know what that person looks like. I know what their personality is like. I suppose it's because I spent so long observing people that I don't really have to spend much time developing a character. They're sort of already fully formed in my head before they even appear, so to speak.
Yeah. So I actually had a conversation with my kinsman who also appeared in Bizarchives 1. His name's Shane. He wrote Baby Teeth, which is a
Mm,
really good supernatural horror. Maybe one of these days I'll be able to drag him on and get on the microphone too. But
mm,
me and him had this conversation, and he was like saying that he likes to map out the entirety of the story beforehand and all this little stuff. And I kind of just said, I just let it unfold. And he was like really kind of like baffled by this, that I have this, kind of shoot from the hip kind of process to my writing. I don't. I'll generally have like an idea of how the direction of the story, but 9 times out of 10, the ending and the stuff that happens along the way gets completely scrapped and changed into something else. And by the time I'm like, okay, this story is done, I look back at the
mm.
story and it's completely different than what I set out to do. So when I read a story, it's like it really just kind of unfolds before me, and I just let it take a life of its own. Would you say that you have a process that's similar to mine, or would you say that you're a little bit more meticulous in planning out your story?
Well, for your description of how you plan your stories, Dave, is spookily accurate to how I write mine. I have tried putting out a full story before. Whenever I do that, I always find that as the story's being written, what's being written doesn't really fit with the ideas I already had in my head. So I've learned to abandon plotting out anything too heavily. I have a vague idea, and usually I just write a first draft. I just get all the words down on the page. Often it's completely incoherent and it would not be published in any place anywhere. But I get all the ideas out there, and it just sort of naturally forms and naturally becomes a story. And it's only afterwards I really put any care and attention into manicuring what's there into an actual readable story.
That's really interesting. I think there's a couple different approaches to story writing, and like kind of what you're describing is very similar to how I do it. I sort of just let the story write itself, and then there's guys out there that they map out the entire skeleton, the outline. They know exactly who's going to say what, how's it going to happen, and then they just follow the procedure. So it's really interesting to hear the writing processes of different people.
Yeah, yeah. I think one thing that puts off a lot of new authors actually is they don't know how they're supposed to write a story, and I can understand from the perspective of new writers because we've all been a new writer at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is really no set perfect way of how you go about writing a story. Everybody has their own way. Everybody has their own setup, a place they prefer to write or a medium they prefer to use. So I just like to say that to anybody listening that there is no right or wrong way to write a story.
So for somebody that's maybe thinking about, because I actually get this message quite a bit from folks.
Hmm.
They say, "Man, I really want to submit something, but I don't know if I'm good enough. I just, I don't know if." They're like unsure, and there's a lot of self doubt before they submit and stuff like that. And a lot of times, there are actually quite a few guys that are in Bizarchives 1 that have stories that people absolutely love. They were pretty
Hmm.
sheepish, and they were kind of spooked on submitting something. Do you have any sort of advice to somebody that may feel like that before they submit their story, and they're kind of experiencing the hurdle of self doubt?
Well, I can understand that hurdle myself very, very fully, actually. I mean, I was incredibly nervous about submitting to a Bizarchive. I've never submitted any prose to any magazine, book, or anything like that before. And my biggest advice would be to write your story, to write your story how you want to write it, and be willing to take criticism. If you're willing to submit a work, then it's best to be prepared for some criticism. I'm not saying this to put people off. I think you have to understand that criticism is a very good thing. My first draft of The Career of Drewbury Moore, as I said previously, was absolutely, I consider it absolutely appalling. It's unreadable. But I first showed it to a few friends and they gave me some tips and I reworked it into a far better story. So that's my main advice is don't be afraid of criticism. Constructive criticism is the best thing somebody can do for you if you're a new author. Just learn to take that criticism on board and you'll be a much better writer for it and you'll learn much quicker. So don't basically just and it sounds a bit glib, but don't be scared to submit the work to somebody to the Biz Archive or anywhere else, especially to a Biz Archive. Actually, I find that people already on the Biz Archive project have been very helpful to me, and I've had a lot of praise for my story, and also had a lot of very constructive and useful criticism that has really helped me. And I'd say just don't hold back. Write your story and submit it as soon as possible. I don't think there's very many people out there who live to regret that.
Excellent, excellent. So when when we're talking about putting these kinds of projects together, what do you think? If for folks out there that might want to create something similar to the Bizarchives, because I had a guy reach out to me and he was really inspired by our project that we have going on here, but he wanted to do something that was specifically for epic fantasy and hard sci-fi and not so much into the spooky stuff. What would you say to somebody that is trying to put something similar to the Bizarchives together?
Well, I imagine it will be possible. I mean, I imagine you'll know more about that than I would, Dave, actually. But as long as you've got the will to do it, then there are plenty of excellent authors out there who can provide stories for such a work. So, and of course, I imagine there are people in the Biz Archives who would be willing to give advice to anybody wanting to do such a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say if you want to put out a project similar to the Bizarchives, do reach out to me and I'll give you whatever you want to know. I'll tell you everything, anything that can help you. We'll give you a shout, whatever we can do to help you guys out. We want to bring Pulp Fiction back. And
Mm.
speaking of Pulp Fiction, Mr. Robert, you mentioned Lovecraft. What is your opinion on what makes a good pulp story, and what were kind of the pulp authors that really inspired you?
Well, like I said, H.P. Lovecraft. I've not delved greatly deeply into works of pulp fiction myself, other than H.P. Lovecraft. I don't suppose you could count out. No, you couldn't count Poe as pulp, but I'm mainly inspired by that kind of horror fiction, really. And it's,
Mhm.
I suppose, what inspired me most is that kind of creeping feeling that the stories give you, that feeling of the unknown lurking somewhere with an intelligence behind it, wanting to do you harm. I think I've always identified very strongly with that idea, and it's triggered my imagination.
Very cool. Very cool. All right, we are coming up on the end of the interview here, but Mr. Robert, what do you think? What do you think is going to be coming up next for you? I know you mentioned you want to work on a novella. You have some longer works in the queue, but is there anything that you would like to throw out there as like maybe a little taste of what they can expect from you moving forward?
Well, like I said, another Ruben Bennett story has been written. When it will be released is a bit up in the air at the moment, but expect expect to see a return of Ruben and Eleanor and Joseph in the near future. Although the story will be slightly different. It will still be to do with supernatural horror, but there will be some slight different changes in theme to the first story, as it does involve demons and their conspiracy involving corrupt churchmen. So watch out for that.
Very, very cool. All right, Mr. Robert, we're coming up on the end here, but I want everybody to make sure you go over to thebizarchives.com. It says there on the thing, issue 1 available at thebizarchives.com, or you can just go type it in on Amazon and get a copy of the Bizarchives Weird Tales of Monsters, Magic, and Machines, issue 1. Issue 2 is going to be hopefully available coming up towards late December, stuff like that. And then also, we have a novella coming out in the next couple months from our boy A. Cuthbertson, who is the author of Tanner's Gold, and we are going to have him on when that's about to drop to get to know him. And he's another really, really brilliant writer, Englishman as well. And we got a lot of stuff lined up for you guys, so everybody stay tuned. And before we close out here, thank you, Mr. Robert, for coming on and chatting with everybody and letting everybody know. Robert is the author of Kiriath of Drewbury-Moor, which is the first story featured in the Bizarchives. So when you get your copy of Bizarchives and you crack it open, the number 1 story, the first one you will read is Mr. Robert's, and it has gotten a lot of praise. A lot of folks really love it. It's a supernatural horror of the English flavor, and it's really, really great stuff. Before we close out, I want to make sure that everybody knows that this episode of the Bizarcast was brought to you by Jotunheim Nutrition. Stop giving your money to multinational globalist vampires that hate your guts and sell you poison. I'm telling you, stop giving them your money. Jotunheim Nutrition is all GMO free. Great stuff created by our boy Marcus, the golden one, the glorious lion himself, and he makes great products because he truly cares about the people and he wants to make good stuff to help us with our health, wealth, and happiness. So go to jotunheimnutrition.com and get yourself the best way in America, or you can pick up his Treasures from the Old World pack, which features all kinds of cool stuff and some really good organic coffee. So go to jotunheimnutrition.com. And Mr. Robert, thank you again for coming on. We'll talk to you again very soon. And everybody stay tuned for the next episode of Bizarcast coming up very, very soon. This has been brought to you by Big Dave Martell and the Bizarchives, publishers of weird fiction. I'll see you guys next time.